I didn't move to the coast to find anyone. I came here to disappear, to trade the shriek of city sirens for the roar of the ocean, to let the salt-laced wind scour the noise from my head. For 2 years, it worked. My life was a meticulously curated collection of quiet routines. Right from dawn until noon, walk the cliff path until my legs ached, read by the fire until my eyes grew heavy. My cottage was my fortress, a small, sturdy defense against the messy unpredictability of other people. And then there was him, Julian. He lived in the cottage next to mine, the one closer to the rocky shore, its paint peeling in the same melancholic way as my own. He was as much a part of the landscape as the gulls and the granite cliffs. A fisherman. I knew this from the pre-dawn rumble of his truck and the scent of brine and diesel that sometimes drifted on the breeze. I knew it from the sturdy, sea-weathered lines of him. From the safe distance of my writing desk window, I had cataloged him. He was tall, broad in a way that spoke of labor, not of gyms. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, perpetually damp from sea spray or rain. His face, when I could catch a glimpse of it, was all sharp angles and shadow, set in a permanent expression of grim concentration. He moved with a heavy, deliberate certainty that made my own anxious energy feel like a hummingbird's frantic pulse. He was a physical fact, a force of nature, and I, a man made of ink and anxiety, observed him with a kind of terrified reverence. We never spoke. We were two solitary planets in a shared, tiny orbit, held apart by an invisible gravity of silence and assumption. I assumed he was hard, unbreakable, a man who wrestled with the ocean and won. He probably assumed I was nothing at all, a ghost in the window. The distance between our front doors was maybe 50 feet of overgrown grass and stubborn wildflowers. Emotionally, it might as well have been the entire Atlantic. He was the world of tangible things, of knotted ropes and cold water and the weight of a fish in a net. I was the world of abstractions, of sentences that wouldn't parse and characters who wouldn't cooperate. There was no bridge between those two worlds. I told myself this every day. It was a comfort, a way to frame my longing as a simple, unchangeable fact of geography. He was there, I was here, and the space between was sacred and impassable. The storm wasn't in the forecast. It came out of nowhere, a sudden, violent betrayal by a sky that had been placid blue an hour earlier. The wind hit first, a physical blow that rattled the old window panes in their frames. Then the rain came, not falling but thrown, a horizontal assault against my little fortress. The lights flickered once, twice, and then surrendered, plunging my world into a dim, churning gray. I wasn't scared. I had candles, a fireplace, a collection of books I knew by heart. Storms were part of the bargain I'd made with the coast. I lit a fire, its crackle a small, brave sound against the howl of the wind, and tried to continue my work on my laptop until the battery died. The routine was my anchor. As long as I could cling to the routine, I was safe. But the storm had other ideas. There was a sound that was not wind, not rain, not the roar of the sea. It was a groan, deep and wooden, followed by a splintering crack that seemed to happen right inside my skull. Then, a shuddering impact that vibrated through the floorboards and up my spine. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. A slow, cold drip landed on my cheek. I looked up. A dark stain was spreading across the wooden ceiling above my desk. Another drip hit my notebook, the ink of my latest sentence blurring into an illegible smear. Drip, drip, drip. The rhythm was a merciless clock, counting down the seconds until my sanctuary was breached. A branch from the ancient oak that stood between our cottages, a massive limb, had given way. It had punched a hole in my roof. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the careful walls of my composure. My laptop, my books, my manuscripts, my whole life, my whole world was on and around that desk. I scrambled to move everything, my movements clumsy and useless in the growing dark. The drips became a steady trickle, then a small, determined stream. The fortress was falling. I was dragging my desk away from the deluge when a sudden, impossibly bright light flooded the room. I flinched back, shielding my eyes. The light was coming through the window. It was the beam of a heavy-duty flashlight, and behind it, a silhouette stood in the torrential rain, a dark, solid shape against the chaos. Julian. He was drenched, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his jacket shedding water in sheets. He didn't shout over the storm. He didn't have to. His presence was its own proclamation. For a moment, we just stared at each other through the glass and the rain. Me, a panicked mess in a dying room, and him, a pillar of calm in the heart of the tempest. Then he lowered the flashlight and gestured, a short, sharp jerk of his head, towards his own cottage. It wasn't a question. It was a command, a statement of the obvious. You can't stay there. Come here. My feet were rooted to the floor. Going into his house felt like a bigger, more dangerous storm than the one raging outside. It was a breach of the unspoken treaty that had governed our 2 years of silent coexistence. But the water was pooling on the floorboards, and the cold was seeping into my bones. I had no choice. The routine was broken. The anchor was gone. I was adrift, and he was the only shore in sight. He held his door open as I stumbled across the 50 feet of soaked earth that had once felt like a continent. The wind tried to push me back, to keep me in my own ruined box, but I fought against it, my thin sweater a useless shield. I didn't have a coat. I never went out in weather like this. The inside of his cottage was the opposite of the storm. It was warm, dry, and smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, something uniquely him, a faint, clean scent of salt and cold air. A single lantern on the main table cast a pool of steady, golden light, turning the small space into a haven. He closed the door, and the roar of the wind was instantly muted, reduced to a distant, frustrated howl. The silence that fell between us was immense, heavier than any I had ever experienced. It was a silence full of unasked questions and unspoken histories. "You're soaked," he said. His voice. I'd never heard it up close before. It was deeper than I'd imagined, a low rumble like stones shifting underwater. It wasn't unkind. It was just a fact. I stood there, dripping on his clean wooden floor, unable to form a word. My mind, usually a torrent of language, was empty. I could only stare at him. Up close, he was more. The shadows under his eyes were darker. There was a small, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His hands, as he unzipped his heavy jacket, were calloused and marked, the hands of a man who worked with them every day. My own hands, soft and stained with ink, felt pale and useless by comparison. "Go on. Get that off before you freeze," he nodded toward my dripping sweater. He turned his back, giving me a semblance of privacy, and stoked the fire in the stone hearth. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room was simple, functional. A sturdy wooden table, 2 chairs, a worn armchair by the fire. Shelves filled not with books, but with neatly coiled ropes, fishing lures, and an old brass compass. It was the room of a man who needed things to work, not to be beautiful. And yet, there was a kind of beauty in its stark efficiency. I pulled off my sweater, my skin prickling in the sudden chill. My t-shirt beneath was damp, clinging unpleasantly. I felt exposed, stripped down, not just of a layer of clothing, but of the protective shell of my solitude. Julian turned back, a thick, dark blanket in his hands. He didn't hand it to me. He stepped forward into my space and wrapped it around my shoulders himself. His proximity was overwhelming. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My breath caught in my throat. My heart, which had been pounding with panic, now pounded with something else entirely. Something far more dangerous. His fingers brushed the side of my neck as he adjusted the wool. The touch was accidental, fleeting, no more than a whisper of contact. But it landed on my skin like a brand. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through me. My entire body went rigid. I am certain he felt me flinch. Heat. Just heat. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Confusion? Surprise? He took a half step back, reestablishing the space between us. The air crackled with the energy of that tiny, unintentional connection. The storm outside had nothing on the one that had just erupted inside me. He said, the word clipped. He turned away again, moving toward the small kitchenette. Or coffee. I've got coffee. Please, I managed to say, my voice a strained whisper. I wrapped the blanket tighter around myself. The rough was a comforting friction against my skin. But I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my neck, a single, searing point of contact that had just redrawn the map of my world. I watched him move. The economy of his motion was mesmerizing. No wasted steps, no hesitation. He lit a small gas burner with a practiced flick of a lighter, filled a kettle from a large jug of water, measured coffee grounds into a press. His competence was a quiet language I was only just beginning to understand. He seemed as comfortable and capable in this small domestic space as I imagined he was on the deck of his boat in a churning sea. He brought 2 heavy ceramic mugs to the table and gestured for me to sit. I did, perching on the edge of the chair, the blanket still clutched around me like a shield. He sat opposite me, his large frame seeming to fill the small chair completely. He didn't speak. He just watched the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. He wasn't what I had built him up to be in my head. The distant, intimidating figure was gone. In his place was a man who looked tired. There was a weariness in the set of his shoulders that I had never been able to see from my window. A deep-seated exhaustion that the firelight couldn't quite erase. He wasn't unbreakable. He was just quiet. The kettle whistled, a shrill, domestic sound that cut through the tension. He got up and made the coffee, his back to me once more. I found myself studying the worn fabric of his shirt, the way it stretched across his broad back. I was noticing things, small things. The way he favored his right leg slightly when he stood. The faded ink of a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. What looked like the tail of a fish or serpent. Details that were invisible from 50 feet away. He set a mug in front of me. Steam rose from it, carrying the rich, bitter scent of dark roast. I wrapped my cold hands around the warm ceramic, a small island of comfort in a sea of anxiety. Your roof, he said, finally breaking the silence. It's bad. I nodded, unable to look at him. I stared into my coffee instead. The old oak, I knew that branch would go one day. Should have taken it down last year. He said it with a note of self-recrimination, as if my damaged roof was somehow his fault. It's not your tree, I said quietly. It's between us, he replied, and the simple statement hung in the air, suddenly laden with a double meaning that I was sure he didn't intend. Between us. The tree, the storm, the 50 feet of grass. All of it. We drank our coffee in silence. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a thrumming awareness of him, of the situation. I was in Julian's house. I was wearing his blanket. I was drinking his coffee. Every carefully constructed wall I had built around myself had been washed away in the space of an hour. Then he did something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. He stood, walked over to a corner, and came back with a tangled mess of green netting and a small curved knife. He dropped the net on the table between us. I need a hand with this, if you've got nothing better to do. He looked at me directly, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded. It was a straightforward request. There's a tear. My fingers are too clumsy for these small knots. He was asking for my help. Me. The ghost in the window. The man with soft, ink-stained hands. He was admitting a weakness, a limitation. He was a man of brute force and grand gestures, of hauling nets from the unforgiving sea. I was a man of nuance, of finding the right word, of untangling complex sentences. And now he was asking me to untangle this. The power dynamic, which had felt so skewed, so utterly one-sided, suddenly leveled. I can try, I said, my voice gaining a sliver of confidence. He showed me the tear, a ragged hole in the intricate diamond pattern. He explained the type of knot required to fix it, his large, calloused finger tracing the line I needed to follow. His head was bent close to mine, and I could smell the rain in his hair, the scent of the ocean that clung to him like a second skin. I focused on the net, on the task, using it as an anchor. My fingers, nimble from years of typing, found a surprising dexterity with the thin, tough twine. I worked, and he watched. I could feel his gaze on my hands. I could feel the heat of his presence beside me. The world shrank to the space of that small table, to the lantern light, the sound of the storm, and the shared, quiet task. He was giving me something to do, a purpose in his space beyond just being a victim of the weather. He was letting me in, not just to his house, but to a small part of his world. The knots were complicated, but my mind locked onto the pattern, the puzzle of it. For the first time all night, my anxiety receded, replaced by a deep, unwavering focus. I was good at this. It was like editing a difficult paragraph, finding the broken threads and weaving them back into a coherent whole. When I was finished, I laid the mended section flat on the table. It wasn't perfect, but it was strong. Julian ran his thumb over my work, his touch surprisingly gentle on the rough twine. "Good," he said. And in that one word, I felt a current of validation that was more potent than any praise I'd ever received for my writing. Better than I could have done, the storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the wind howled with renewed fury, and the rain beat a relentless tattoo on the roof. Julian's roof. A solid, undamaged roof. "You'll have to stay the night," he said. It wasn't a question. It was another statement of fact, of the undeniable reality of our situation. "You can take the bed." "I'll take the couch." "No, I can't." "I'll take the couch," I protested immediately. The thought of sleeping in his bed was too much, too intimate, a violation of a boundary I hadn't even known existed until this moment. "Don't be an idiot," he said, not unkindly. "You're my guest, and you're half frozen. You take the bed." He stood, his decision made, leaving no room for argument. He was a man accustomed to being in charge of his boat, of his life. He was in charge of this situation, too. He had a small bedroom off the main living area. He pulled a clean t-shirt and a pair of worn, soft sweatpants from a drawer and handed them to me. "They'll be big on you, but they're dry." I took them, the fabric still holding a faint warmth in his scent. I changed in the small, dark room, my back to the door, my heart a frantic, trapped bird against my ribs. His room was even more Spartan than the living area. A bed, a single dresser, a framed photograph on the wall. Too dark to see what it was of. It was the room of a man who spent very little time in it. Or perhaps a man who carried his home on the sea with him. When I came out, wearing his clothes, feeling both swamped and strangely comforted by them, he had already set up the couch for himself with a pillow and a rough-looking blanket. The lantern was turned down low, casting long, dancing shadows. The world had been reduced to this small, warm room, a tiny ship on a raging sea. I hesitated by the bedroom door. "Thank you, Julian." For everything, he was standing by the fire, his back to me, staring into the flames. "Just get some sleep, Elias." He knew my name. Of course he knew my name. The mailboxes were side by side at the end of the lane. Still, hearing him say it, hearing my own name in that low, rumbling voice, sent another shockwave through my system. I had been a ghost, a nameless observer, but he had been observing me right back. He knew my name. Elias. I retreated into the bedroom and closed the door, my mind reeling. I slid into his bed. The sheets were cool and crisp, and they smelled of him, of salt and wind and clean linen. I lay there, staring into the darkness, listening to the storm outside and the sound of him settling onto the couch in the next room. I was in Julian's bed. The man who had been a distant, intimidating figure of my imagination was now just a thin wooden door away. The sheer, impossible intimacy of it was suffocating. Sleep felt a million miles away. I must have drifted off eventually, lulled by the rhythmic roar of the ocean and the unfamiliar warmth of the room. But I woke some time later in that deep, disorienting part of the night when the world feels thin and strange. The storm had quieted to a dull, persistent moan. The house was utterly silent. I heard a noise from the other room, a low sound, tight and pained. I sat up, my senses on high alert. Was he hurt? Was something wrong? I held my breath, listening. It came again, a choked-off sound of distress. He was having a nightmare. Without thinking, I slipped out of the bed. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I crept to the door and eased it open a crack. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint, demonic red light across the room. I could see his shape on the couch, a large mass under the blanket. He was thrashing, his whole body tense, caught in the grip of some unseen terror. He muttered something, a name I couldn't understand, his voice thick with sleep and fear. My heart went out to him. This strong, silent man, who faced the Atlantic for a living, was just as vulnerable to the demons of the night as anyone else. Perhaps more so. I should have gone back to bed. I should have closed the door and respected his privacy. But I couldn't. I couldn't leave him like that. I tiptoed into the room. "Julian?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond, just groaned again, twisting in the blanket. I reached out, my hand hovering over his shoulder, uncertain. What was I doing? This was insane. But the sound of his distress was a hook in my gut. I touched his shoulder. "Julian, wake up." His eyes flew open. He didn't shout. He didn't lash out. He just stared up at me, his eyes wide and wild in the dim light, full of a raw, naked panic. He was seeing not me, but the ghost of his dream. He scrambled upright, breathing hard, the blanket pooling around his waist. He was shirtless. I hadn't realized. In the faint glow of the embers, I could see the powerful lines of his chest and shoulders, the dark shape of that tattoo coiling over his arm. "It's just me," I said softly. "Elias, you were dreaming." Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes, chasing the fear away. The wildness subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering awareness. He looked at my hand, still resting on his shoulder. He looked at my face, inches from his. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a voltage that had nothing to do with the storm. "I see you," he said, his voice a rough, broken whisper. It was almost an accusation. From my window, "I see you," riding my breath hitched. The confession I'd half expected, half dreaded. He saw me. He'd been watching too. All this time, my one-sided observation had been a conversation. A silent, shared surveillance across 50 feet of grass. "You're always alone," he breathed, his gaze searching mine, looking for something I couldn't name. "Always, so are you," I whispered back, the words leaving my lips before I could stop them. It was the truest thing I had ever said. Something in his expression broke. The carefully constructed wall of stoicism crumbled, and for a heartbeat, I saw the profound loneliness he kept hidden behind his silent competence. It was a loneliness that mirrored my own, and in that moment of shared, silent understanding, the distance between us vanished completely. He didn't move. I didn't move. The world seemed to hold its breath. I could feel the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of my borrowed shirt, the solid muscle under my palm. I should have pulled away. I should have retreated to the safety of the bedroom, to the rules of our old world. But I couldn't. I was caught in the gravity of him, of this moment. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his hand and cupped the back of my neck. The same place his fingers had brushed hours before. But this time it was no accident. The touch was deliberate, questioning. His thumb stroked my skin, a slow, mesmerizing rhythm that sent a shiver down my spine. His eyes never left mine, asking a question he didn't seem to know how to voice. And I answered. I leaned in. The kiss was not what I would have expected. It wasn't rough or demanding. It was slow, tentative. A question answered with another question. His lips were chapped from the wind and tasted faintly of salt and coffee. It was a kiss of profound, staggering honesty. It was the first truly honest conversation we had ever had. It spoke of loneliness and longing, of silent observation and a desperate, unspoken need for connection. He pulled me closer, his other arm wrapping around my waist, lifting me slightly, so I was half kneeling, half leaning over him on the couch. The kiss deepened, losing its hesitation, gaining a quiet, desperate certainty. It was a discovery, a mapping of new territory. My hands moved from his shoulder to his hair, my fingers sinking into the thick, damp strands. It felt impossibly real. This was Julian, not the myth I had created, but the man, warm and solid and real, holding me in the dead of night as if he were afraid I might disappear. And I was holding him right back, terrified of the same thing. We were just two lonely men, clinging to each other in a storm, And for the first time in a very long time, neither of us was alone. The world outside, with its wind and its rain and its broken roofs, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the dying fire, the soft friction of his stubble against my skin, and the stunning, terrifying realization that this was not a dream. This was happening. I woke to silence. A profound, unnerving silence. The storm was over. Sunlight, pale and watery, was streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. For a moment, I was disoriented. The smell of wood smoke and salt. The unfamiliar weight of a heavy blanket. Then memory came rushing back, a tidal wave of heat and sensation. The kiss. His hands. His voice. I was on the couch. Alone. I sat up, my heart beginning a frantic, panicked rhythm against my ribs. The blanket he'd been using was folded neatly at the end of the couch. The lantern was extinguished. The fire was a pile of cold, gray ash. The mugs we had used were washed and sitting in a drainer by the sink. The cottage was empty. A cold dread, far more chilling than the rain-soaked sweater of the night before, seeped into me. He was gone. I scrambled up, his borrowed sweatpants feeling loose and ridiculous. I looked around the small, tidy room. It was as if last night had never happened. No, that wasn't right. It was as if last night had been meticulously erased. Scrubbed clean. I went to the window. His truck was gone. The world outside was washed clean, glistening in green after the rain. The sky was a fragile, hopeful blue. But my own internal landscape was turning a dark, ominous gray. He'd left. He'd woken up, seen me there, and fled. The thought was a physical blow. Regret. It had to be regret. What had I been thinking? I had taken his kindness, his offer of shelter, and I had twisted it into this. I had misread everything. The nightmare, the vulnerability, the shared loneliness. It was just a product of the storm, a strange, feverish dream born of darkness and proximity. And in the clear, unforgiving light of morning, he had seen his mistake and run from it. Shame washed over me, hot and suffocating. I felt foolish, pathetic, the reclusive writer spinning fantasies about the strong, silent man next door. I had imposed my own narrative on him, and he had escaped as soon as he could. I had to get out of there. I couldn't be there when he got back, couldn't face the awkward silence, the polite but firm rejection. I found my clothes from the night before, still damp, and changed with frantic, clumsy movements. I folded his shirt and sweatpants, placing them in a neat pile on the bed I should have stayed in. I smoothed the blanket on the couch, tried to erase any sign that I had been there, that I had crossed a line I never should have approached. I all but ran back to my own cottage, the 50 feet of wet grass feeling like a mile-long walk of shame. The damage in the light of day was both better and worse than I'd imagined. The branch was enormous, a jagged spear thrust through my roof. But the leak had been contained to one area. My desk was soaked, my chair ruined. A stack of books was warped beyond repair. But my laptop, which I'd moved just in time, was safe. My manuscripts were safe. My small, ordered world was damaged, but not destroyed. Only I was. The silence of my own cottage was different now. Before, it had been a comfort, a chosen solitude. Now it was an absence. It was the echo of a conversation that had ended too soon. It was the empty space where his presence had been. I could feel the lack of him like a phantom limb. The day passed in a blur of anxious activity. I called a roofer who promised he could come in a week. A week. I moved my desk to the other side of the room. I mopped up the water. I tried to work, but the words wouldn't come. Every sentence I wrote felt hollow, false. My mind was stuck in a loop, replaying every moment from the night before, analyzing every glance, every touch, every word, torturing myself with all the ways I'd gotten it wrong. I kept glancing out the window. His driveway remained empty. The sun climbed higher, then began its slow descent, painting the sky in strokes of orange and pink. Still no truck. He's out on the boat. A rational part of my brain supplied, checking his pots, assessing the damage from the storm. It's what he does. It's his job. But the anxious, screaming part of my brain had a different story. He's staying away. He's waiting for you to leave. He's avoiding you. He He wishes last night never happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my own bed in my own cold, quiet cottage and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. The solitude I had once cherished now felt like a punishment, a prison of my own making. I had tasted connection, a brief, electrifying moment of it, and now its absence was a hunger, an ache that permeated everything. I had been fine being a ghost in the window, but now I knew what it was to be seen, and being invisible again was unbearable. Another day passed, the same agonizing routine. Checking the window, the empty driveway, the crushing, definitive silence. I didn't see him. I didn't hear his truck. My hope, which had been a stubborn, flickering candle, was finally extinguished. It was over before it had even begun. I had to accept it. I had to rebuild my walls stronger this time. I had to forget the taste of salt and coffee, the feel of his hand on my neck, the impossible, fleeting feeling of being truly seen. On the evening of the second day, I gave up. I sat by my cold hearth, not even bothering to light a fire, and resigned myself to the new, painful reality. I would fix my roof. I would go back to my routine. In time, the memory of that night would fade, becoming just another story I told myself. Julian would remain a figure in the landscape, and I would go back to being a ghost. It was better this way, safer. A knock on the door made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. It couldn't be. I didn't move. Maybe if I stayed quiet, they would go away. It was probably the roofer coming early. It couldn't be him. Another knock, louder this time, more insistent. With trembling legs, I got up and walked to the door. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for, I didn't know what. I opened it. It was Julian. He stood on my doorstep, backlit by the fading twilight. He looked exhausted, worse than he had during the storm. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed. He was holding something in his hand. We stared at each other for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick with 2 days of unspoken fear and misunderstanding. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't used it in days. I stepped back, holding the door open. He walked past me into the cottage, his presence immediately filling the small space, changing its very atmosphere. He looked at the hole in my ceiling, the displaced furniture. "I'm a coward," he said, not looking at me. He was looking at the damage, but I knew he wasn't talking about the roof. I closed the door, my hand shaking on the knob. "You left." It came out as a whisper, an accusation I hadn't meant to voice. He said, finally turning to face me. His eyes were filled with a startling vulnerability. The strong, silent facade was gone. He just looked lost. I ran. I don't know how to do this. Do what?" I asked, my voice barely holding steady. "This," he said, gesturing vaguely at the space between us. "Feelings. Talking. All of it. I'm good with boats. And nets. And the sea. The sea is simple. You fight it or you respect it. You don't have to understand it." He took a breath. "I woke up, and you were there. And it was real. And it scared the hell out of me. All the air left my lungs. It wasn't regret. It was fear. The same fear that had kept me locked in my cottage for 2 years. The same fear that told me it was safer to be alone." He felt it too. "I thought you regretted it." I confessed, the words tasting of ash. "I thought I made a mistake." "No," he said, the words sharp, emphatic. He took a step closer. "The mistake was me leaving. I spent 2 days out on the water, trying to get my head straight, trying to convince myself to just leave it alone, to go back to how things were, and I prompted, my heart hammering. "And I can't," he said simply. "I can't go back to just watching you through the window. It's not enough anymore." He took another step, closing the distance between us. He smelled of sea air and engine oil and exhaustion. He looked down at me, his gaze intense, searching. "Elias, I'm not good at this. I will probably mess it up, but I want to try. If you'll let me." The hope that I had so carefully buried burst through the soil of my doubt, fierce and undeniable. Tears pricked my eyes, and I blinked them away angrily. "I'm not very good at it either," I admitted, a watery, broken laugh escaping me. A small smile touched his lips, the first I had ever seen. It transformed his face, easing the harsh lines. Maybe we could be not good at it together. He lifted his hand, the one that had been clenched at his side. He opened his fingers. Lying on his calloused palm was a single, old-fashioned brass key. "My spare," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "In case it storms again." Or, just in case, he was offering me a key. A key to his house, to his life. It was a tangible promise. A symbolic gesture so profound, so much more powerful than any flowery, poetic words I could ever write. It was an anchor. I reached out and took it from him. The metal was warm from his skin. Our fingers brushed, and this time, neither of us flinched. The jolt was still there, but it was no longer a shock. It was a current, a connection, solid, real. I closed my hand around the key, the sharp edges digging into my palm. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." Julian, the tension that had held him so rigidly, seemed to drain away. He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of profound relief. And then he wrapped his arms around me and pulled me against his chest, holding me tightly. I buried my face in his jacket, inhaling the scent of him, the scent of the sea, the scent of home. He held me not with the desperate passion of that night on the couch, but with a steady, reassuring strength, a promise of shelter, a promise of staying. The next morning, I woke up in his bed. This time, when I opened my eyes, he was there. He was propped up on one elbow, watching me, a soft, sleepy expression on his face. The morning light fell across his features, erasing the shadows, revealing the man I was only just beginning to know. "Morning," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Morning," I replied, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. There was no anxiety, no fear, just a quiet, settled peace that I had never known before. The world felt right. We started making coffee together. It became our routine. He would come in from the boat, cold and smelling of the sea, and I would have the kettle on, ready. We would sit at his small table, sipping from the heavy, ceramic mugs, and he would tell me about his day, about the color of the water, the weight of the catch, the strange moods of the ocean. And I would tell him about mine, about the characters who were giving me trouble, about a sentence that finally clicked into place. We were translating our worlds for each other, building a bridge across the 50 feet of grass with words and shared silences. My roof got fixed. My cottage was put back in order, but I spent less and less time there. My books started migrating to a shelf he cleared for me. My laptop found a permanent home on a corner of his table. My world, once confined to the four walls of my fortress, was expanding to include his. Our solitudes were merging, creating something new, something shared. Sometimes I would stand at his window, the one he had watched me from, and I would look across at my own empty cottage. It looked small and a little sad, a relic from a life I no longer lived. I had come here to be alone, to build walls against the world. I thought solitude was safety, but I was wrong. Safety wasn't a wall. It was a key in your pocket. It was the sound of a truck pulling into the driveway at the end of the day. It was the quiet comfort of another person breathing beside you in the dark. Julian was the storm I never saw coming. He broke my roof, shattered my routine, and washed away every carefully constructed defense I had. He wrecked my life. And then, with his steady hands and his quiet, unwavering presence, he built me a new one. A better one. A shared one. He was the plot twist I never knew my story needed, the disruption that led me not back to solitude, but finally, miraculously, home.